Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Roswell NYC's Orbit. And in the orbit with me today is Louis Monoyudis, CMO of Artware Edition. Louis, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself as Chief Marketing Officer of Artware Editions, how you came to be, and what your kind of matriculation in the entire e-com world and D2C commerce has been.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. So
Of
I've
course.
been working at Artware Editions since almost a year at this point, and I've been an advisor to them for several years. And it's a really interesting company in that they have both a very robust B2B business where they sell to interior designers and architects, and then they also sell online. The company at a high level works with the estates of well-known artists like Basquiat, Warhol, etc., and creates really beautiful collectible giftable items. It's been a really fun foray into the art adjacent space.
Sounds like super exclusive and super expensive at the same time. But tell us a little bit about some of the objects and items they have and how rare they are. And what's the highest, price product that you ever sold?
It's a good question. So we do have a lot of very accessible price point items. And those are really great for people who are fans of especially some of the pop artists, but obviously may not be going to auction at Sotheby's to get the super high priced items. So it's a nice way to have a piece of that. And a lot of those come through licenses or direct deals with the estates. On the B2B side, we also sell B2C for this particular item, but we do very well with a coffee table from the Yves Klein estate. And those, depending on what's happening in the market, are, $25,000 and above. And we have a really big business around those. The funny thing is, once you see it on the website, you will see it in almost every architectural digest spread from now on.
So you guys are trendsetters in that regard, huh?
I guess so.
I like that. And so are you going to answer me what the highest priced product you ever sold online is? Or is that kind of a secret?
It really just depends on the art market, right? I mean, I think the Yves Klein tables, what's interesting about those in particular is they are a limited edition with the estate every year. So because of demand, sometimes they will end up for auction at Sotheby's, Christie's. And and those will actually get, some really nice prices that go along with them.
So what's your role at Artware Edition as Chief Marketing Officer? And second part of that question is oftentimes CMOs in the digital space serve a different sort of function than the CMOs at a more traditional corporate brick and mortar retailer or brand, if you will. And sometimes even further, the CMO looks after, and oftentimes both the brick and mortar as well as the D2C e-com space. But I've seen a wide variety of situations with all the brands we work with. We have about 70 brands in our portfolio at Roswell's and all the CMOs we've interacted with. There's been a wide spectrum of roles and responsibilities. And I'd like to see, A, what is your role and responsibility with Artware Edition? And how do you think that uniquely fits the business model there?
So most of my career in e-commerce for the past 15 years has really been at kind of earlier stage companies, so like post Series A or post Series B, and coming in and really putting discipline, structure, and process in place. So not just at Artware, but also when I was chief marketing officer at a Japanese snack company called Boxu.
Oh,
Before
yeah.
that, I was at a company in the pet space called Fable Pets, which makes these really beautiful crates. So I've been kind of all around. But before that, I was at bigger companies like Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger, and started my career at a big agency called Leo Burnett, working on brands like Motorola and Morgan Stanley. So I've seen the full range. But to answer your question, it's ever evolving. And there's really, I think the challenge for CMOs, regardless of the size of the company, is to figure out where you're going to point your resources, because no matter how big your budget, you're never going to have enough to do all of the things. There are so many channels and there's new ones coming out every year where, depending
Every
on where
hour, it feels like sometimes.
exactly, it may or may not be the right place to play. And all of those have their own ecosystem of what works and what doesn't. So much of it right now is about creative development, creative testing and iteration, leveraging AI tools for that, of course, and just really thinking about how you're measuring and what the overall strategy is for the marketing, right? If you're trying to get brand awareness and you're much bigger competing against, let's say, Coke versus Pepsi, it's a different than just trying to acquire customers when you're an earlier stage company.
Absolutely. And how involved traditionally are CMOs within the digital commerce experience, D2C, driving traffic to the online store? Because the reason I ask that is that I've seen it run the full spectrum, the full gamut. You have been in touch with certain CMOs and brands that really look at their Shopify store as more of a catalog, which I think is a fallacy and an incorrect way to look at it. We always tell them to look at, if you have 15 stores, physical stores, your Shopify stores are 16, and so on and so forth. That
Yeah.
type of logic, and that's really what we think, and a CMO should be focused on in terms of the spread of the different outlets that he has to reach his customers. But I'd love to hear your opinion on that, Louis.
Yeah, I think that the Shopify store is really one of the marquee places to tell your brand story, as well as to have probably the widest offering of your product portfolio. The thesis that I have is at the end of the day, as long as someone's buying our product, I'm happy. So that could be our own stores, a retail partner, our website, Amazon, TikTok Shop, Walmart.com, Zalando, if you're overseas, wherever it is, as long as they're buying from us and not one of our competitors, we've done our job. Obviously, the margin structure, the inventory challenges, all of that factor into how heavily weighted you would ideally like those different channels to perform. But especially in this age of potentially agentic shopping really getting popular, our websites that's where you can have your fonts and your brand colors and tell your story and have the founders and really get into the customer testimonials and create that emotional connection in a way that's a lot harder in any other channel aside from potentially your own retail storefronts.
Love that. And Louis, you just dropped the magic word that's going to be everywhere in 2026: agentic shopping. Why don't you talk a little bit about your experience there? I just had meetings with the C-suite over at Gorgeous, and their AI sales agent is phenomenal, and I think is going to be, if I was to project, going to be everywhere in 2026. You have now the integration of Shop Pay with ChatGPT and Perplexity, and it's only going to get larger and larger. What's your philosophy on agentic shopping, and how is that going to dramatically, or less so, change the way people conduct shopping or conduct business and go shopping rather in the new year?
I'm cautiously optimistic on the impact it'll have on our business and e-commerce in general. Nobody knows how widely adopted it's going to be, the actual impact it'll have. Right now, there's such a scramble, and I know that you guys work on with a lot of your clients on this in terms of making sure that you're being indexed by the different LLMs and AI tools out there. I think that's a great foundation to make sure that any brand has in place. How much trust customers are going to give, I think really depends on your brand, your target audience, the age of that target audience, how tech savvy
Totally.
they are. But it's really a bit of the Wild West right now. I was speaking at a conference recently and someone was talking about AI. And I just said, I don't know about all of you, but I feel overwhelmed. Like I'm subscribing to so many newsletters and listening to podcasts and going to talks and dinners. And I could spend my entire day just trying to keep up and test out the new tools that are available to us as marketers. There's a lot of people right now that I think are just kind of testing a bunch of stuff and seeing what
But there's a
sticks.
lot of
It's
noise.
a
Do you
lot of
agree?
noise. Yeah. But I think it's great, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we're all personally using GPT both for our own lives, our own work, and thinking how to layer it into our overall flows. What it will mean for customers, we'll have to see. What I'm excited to have this conversation a year from now and see where we are.
Yeah, it's the adoption curve. I really think that we're going to have to watch, because it's the adoption curve from brands who are nervous about being the first to involve or integrate rather AI agents into their buying process. What if it hallucinates? What if it makes a bad impression on a customer? Nobody wants to be the first, but nobody wants to be the last either. So there's that kind of fine needle that you have to thread. And I think, what we're seeing is an adoption of the millennials and Gen Zs in terms of embracing AI as it relates to commerce, and to a certain degree Gen Xers. But I think it's just, the younger generations obviously understand and aren't as shy about AI as some of the older generations. And that brings me to a nice little segue to the next conversation. A historically not very tech savvy audience, the wine industry. I understand that you're going to be speaking at the D2C Wine Symposium in Monterey, California, the second week of January. Is that right?
Yes, I will be giving a 45-minute keynote.
Amazing. And I'm not going to feel bad for you being in the middle of California during January, because here in New York City, you know how bad it is for you and I, Louis. But tell us about what you're going to be talking about and how you're going to address that audience that of the wine industry. And I'll just give you some experience that I have. My wife and I are very much wine. I might say, well, winos or wine connoisseurs or wine snobs, but we definitely appreciate good wine. And my experience in a lot of the wineries out in California or when we've been in Italy and whatnot is that they are fantastic when it comes to creating wine. But when it comes to understanding how to market, sell, and distribute online, not so much. So I'm curious to see what you're going to be talking about in your keynote at the wine symposium as it relates to DTC and how you're going to tactfully be able to explain to all those in the audience how they need to quote unquote get with the times and how they need to embrace D2C commerce as it relates to the wine and spirits industry.
It's a great question. And I do not come from the wine vertical. So I've been doing my diligence as I prepare for the upcoming conference. There's a lot of downward pressure right now on the wine industry overall.
Why is
Coming
that?
into COVID, there was such a boom of wine consumption. There was a lot of investment, a lot of existing vineyards planted more crop. Unfortunately, what's happened is things have changed a little bit, about going back to maybe their pre-pandemic drinking levels, but a couple other things have happened. One is that the younger generation is just not drinking as much. They're
That's
either focusing more on THC or other types of alcoholic beverages or just not drinking,
so
period. We're also seeing that,
these kids. I'm just kidding.
and we're also just seeing that like the wine format has shifted, right? So people are more interested potentially in like single serving cans or things like that. So when I come in and give my talk, it's not going to be about how to solve the particular problems of this wine industry. And there's going to be about 700 people in the audience, ranging from the gallows of the world to the multi-generational vineyard that for them, D2C is actually getting people into, into the tasting room on their winery. It's not even necessarily about selling more wine
What a
online.
fantastic opportunity, though. I mean, to be able to go in to an audience like that and be able to educate them. I mean, the opportunities that you have as CMO in your role to be able to kind of work with these brands and usher them into the new way of doing business and the importance of paying attention, because otherwise they might get left behind. Right?
Absolutely. And one of the core elements of my talk is a framework that I adhere to as a CMO related to how brands communicate with their customers and then the hubris that some, especially CMOs, end up having that doesn't allow for this to happen. So a lot of brands talk about their features, which is the equivalent of going to a party and sitting next to someone that only talks about themselves. At first, it's kind of interesting, but it ends up being boring. So this can be talking
Love
about
it.
thread count or processing speed or the fact that we're organic or biodynamic. Okay, that's cool. But then you have to take it to the next level of what are the benefits? What does that mean for me? However, that's usually not incredibly defensible. So my sheets are a little bit softer, or I don't have to charge my battery as long, things like that. Where it really gets interesting is when you connect an emotional element to it. So I'll give an example. I was brought in from I was working with a private equity firm and was brought in as their turnaround CEO, believe it or not, for a plus size women's swimsuit company. And the company was totally underwater, so to speak, when I came in. And what's that?
Pun intended for swimmer.
Pun
So
intended.
I couldn't resist.
And what the first thing I did was look at their messaging. And they were a legacy brand and they didn't have a lot of competition when they started. But then the marketplace got very saturated. And so they were talking about the fact that they have wider straps, underwire, or some type of like tummy taming mesh, but they weren't really talking about the benefits. So the benefits are, hey, you don't get cuts into your shoulders and you don't have the underwire poking you if it's not sewn in correctly. But who cares? Everyone else is doing that. So what we went on was a listening tour and we started to talk to our customers. And the stories we heard were heartwarming or heartbreaking, depending on how you look at it, which is women were telling us that before they found our brand, that they wouldn't go to the beach with their kids during the summer. And the confidence that we could give them to allow them to feel comfortable opened up a world of possibility with how they were spending time with their friends and family. So once we opened up those stories, that created an emotional connection with our audience, which said, you really understand the pain that we're feeling. Yeah, there's pain when I get a cut on my shoulder, but the challenge that I'm trying to overcome of putting on a bathing suit, you're helping me with that. So
Love that,
the
Louis.
hubris, though, that I see with a lot of brands, and it was true at this company as well, is especially when it's a founder who's also the CEO. I've seen this happen a lot of times where the brand feels very autobiographical. So you're making a lot of decisions based on your personal taste level or your personal experience. But there's a tipping point, right? Usually once you're into the 8-figure category, where your target audience may no longer just be you. So how do you make sure that you're buffering every decision with data and business intelligence and not just what you personally feel is best?
Well said. Well said. So in this arena that you're going to be in Monterey, AI, and we're going to have you on after you talk as well too, because I got to hear how your speech was definitely well received. But how are you going to explain to these guys the importance of AI, especially with an audience that typically, as I mentioned, isn't super tech savvy? But my philosophy on AI is that it's, get on the train or you're going to get run over. AI is not going to take jobs away from people who know how to use AI. They're
Yeah.
going to take jobs away from people who don't use AI. So, how are you going to explain this to this audience of 700?
Yeah. So one of the takeaways from my talk is going to be I'm going to have them scan a QR code if they want and take them to a landing page with a bunch of prompts. And these are prompts that I've used in my businesses. And anyone with a GPT account or Claude can use this. And it's pretty simple where you leverage it to analyze all of your customer sentiment. So you just download all your reviews, scrape what you can from any other platforms that you're on. Even if you have an old school tasting room, take pictures of all the handwritten notes that people have left and start to ask 5 questions. Or sorry, start to ask these questions. What are the 5 reasons why people like us and the 5 objections we have to overcome to get them to purchase from us? Because this is what we have to talk about in our messaging to convert a new customer. And then from there, you can start to layer in who your customer is, what you know about them, and use it to start to build scripts and content so that you can talk to them in a way that really resonates.
I've heard grumblings in the industry of being able to connect Claude via MCP to some of the CRMs out there and CDPs to be able to leverage a conversation like this or an idea of what you're looking to accomplish. And then those segments and those cohorts and analyses of the data will happen almost in real time. Do you think that's a natural progression and a use case for marketers to be able to say, like, we're having this great conversation about what we want to accomplish, the LTV scores, the AOV scores, and perhaps CSAT scores and other things of that nature? And do you think that we're in a world in 2026 where there would be a direct connection with these platforms to be able to create these cohorts and these segments and audiences in real time so that they can be actioned much quicker?
I really hope so. That would save all of us a lot of time and energy.
Yeah, rather than just talking about it, it just gets done, right? While we're doing it, while we're having the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, just to take it a step further. So when I was at Boxu, we did a lot of this and we had done a lot of work on our kind of core 4 customer personas and the different audience patterns around them or behavior patterns around them. But what we started to do is we took this customer sentiment and the objections and we said, okay, now GPT, let's build some scripts that we can start to flight using 11 Labs into Spotify because Spotify is very easy. You can get some initial indications with absolutely no cost for talent in terms of like the hooks that are working. And then once we had at least an indication on hooks that were working, then we were able to work with our creative team and our influencer partners and say, okay, we want to make sure we cover these 10 to 20 hooks with this type of backend content for the rest of the reel. And then we can start to flight those into ads and really start to see what was working. But it was a much quicker turn with really only the involvement of the marketing and the creative teams that didn't have any of that re-editing and voiceover challenges because it was all automated in AI.
Talk a little bit about the a holistic approach that you would recommend for a D2C brand. So it's not just email and SMS siloed against each other. next to loyalty, review. It's really a holistic approach that we embrace here at Roswell. But I'd love to hear from your chief marketing officer standpoint. What do you think is the new direction for holistic, led marketing?
There's three ways that I bucket the advertising and marketing activities for myself and my team. Acquisition, which of course gets all the press and all the focus and most of the media budget. Retention marketing, and then reactivation. And I think reactivation oftentimes gets overlooked, right? So acquisition, obviously, Facebook, Meta, Google, all that fun stuff. Retention, obviously, life cycle, SMS, email. I'm a big fan of direct mail. I know it's having a resurgence. But then also reactivation strategies, particularly if there's any product in your portfolio that has the opportunity to be on a subscription model. But even not, if you're able to get people that have already bought from you and hopefully had a good experience back into the fold, that's pure gold. Really, when I think about structuring my team, allocating the different resources available to us in terms of time and money, that's how I'm layering it in and really looking through that entire full funnel strategy. Because at the end of the day, everyone's focused on CAC and the CAC to LTV ratio, but always like to ladder it up and look at marketing efficiency ratio because, as we know, you spend more on Meta, your SMS program's going to do better. So it's hard to always separate them out with.
Yeah, LTV to CAC, we like to say 3 to 1, but there's so many KPIs out there that are critical for marketers to watch and brands to watch. Leading me to my next question, what do you think the talk track next year is in terms of KPIs and direction at all of the conferences that are in the D2C space next year, ranging from NRF to eTail West, Shop Talk, which Roswell will be at all three, and we would love to have any of the listeners that are here that are with brands attend any of those events. Please reach out to us directly. But where do you plan to be next year, and what do you think the talk track's going to be in Q1 and Q2 of next year at these conferences in relation to how D2C should be approaching D2C commerce?
It's going to continue to be more of a deep dive into AI. It's funny if you think about the topics of conversation at NRF and Shop Talk and all of those, 3-4 years ago, it was all blockchain.
Yeah, Web3, headless, Yeah.
Totally. Now it's AI. I do feel that as a industry, we're kind of moving through it as a broader cohort. Obviously, there's people much ahead or people behind, but now everyone has at least, LLM associated with their business in some somewhat meaningful way, right? So now we're past that. Okay, how do I prompt correctly, which I think was the very beginning foundation. Now people are really looking at what are the tools that are going to automate some of these processes that take a lot of time, right? The analysis of creative, the understanding of cross-platform attribution, things like this. And that's where I'm seeing a lot of excitement. And just following up with the VC investments, it seems like that's also where the dollars are going.
Totally. And speaking of finance and the markets, feel free to say you're unclear, but everybody seems to have an opinion. Do you think the market is oversaturated and overvalued right now in terms of AI?
Sure.
All right.
Because the adoption is growing so quickly. Now, I think where there's going to be some breakage is there's a lot of platforms out there right now that are just doing a little bit of customization on top of an LLM. And if they can really start to differentiate, then there's going to be a lot of value for those particular tools. But I think right now, some of them are pretty flimsy as they get past the MVP status. So we'll see exactly where they go. But the monthly users on GPT is just insane, right? That doesn't feel like a bubble to me. I think the limiting factors are going to be more on the energy and the data center side of things, where I know there's a lot of investment happening.
Yeah, if you're just playing around on ChatGPT one evening, it's the equivalent of somebody taking 2 showers or something like that. I don't know. That could have been just urban legend, but I'm hearing all this craziness. Ideal tech stack as a CMO in the Shopify ecosystem, if you're willing to share.
Yeah. Big fan of Shopify. I will not work at a company if they're not already on Shopify or willing to migrate to Shopify. I've been on other platforms and I know they have made gains since I were last on them, but there's just an entire ecosystem of apps and partners that make it very easy and intuitive. What's that?
On the MarTech side of things, what's your go-to stack?
Yeah, definitely. I like Klaviyo. I like Gorgeous. I like Postpilot. I like Just Uno. I like, there's a lot of, these different tools out there, but I think really the main one for me is Shopify, Klaviyo, gorgeous. And then you can layer in if you want to do loyalty or some of those other ones.
That's all the time we have today. Appreciate your time, Louis. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have you on after that fantastic keynote that you're going to be
Thank
giving
you.
in Monterey, California in 2026. And we're going to talk and see how all of your predictions and all of your projections actually came to be. Hey, Monoyudis, appreciate you having you on. Again, everybody, this has been Orbit with Louis Monoyudis here with Roswell NYC. My name is Nihar and see you on the next episode.